This is about the horrible situation in Ukraine, which is continuously developing. We're recording this on February 28th afternoon here in Macau. And what I want to do is present a short analysis why we got there and where it's potentially getting us. I recently watched a video which has more, I think, than 10 million views on YouTube by the University of Chicago professor John Mearsheimer. The talk is from 2015, and in this talk he's describing the state of the Ukraine crisis at the time. And he's suggesting that the best solution to the crisis would have been to agree on Ukraine being some sort of buffer or bridge state between Russia and the EU and NATO, which would have some sort of neutral status and would have good relations to both sides. And Mearsheimer thinks that would have been primarily also in the best interest of Ukraine itself. Well, that didn't happen. And a major reason why it didn't happen was that the EU and NATO had an even better thing from their perspective in mind, namely that Ukraine would eventually seek closer and closer relations with the EU, eventually become an EU member, and hopefully eventually also a NATO member, which would then, I guess this was the idea behind it, also have an influence on somehow making Russia a more, let's say, EU-like state, and also somehow influence the situation in Russia. Well, this didn't happen. What happened instead was that the crisis in the Ukraine in 2014 was intensified because the more Russian-friendly government was toppled, and then a more EU-friendly government took over, but this created more conflict with the Russian side. Russia reacted quite hostile to this, and as Mearsheimer said, what the Russians were doing, they were more working towards basically wrecking Ukraine by taking away Crimea, and also through the continuous conflict in the Donbass region. This was certainly bad for Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands of people left the country. The country still continued to be one of the most corrupt and kleptocratic countries in Europe, not that much different from Russia, probably, which was still somehow okay for also the West, because they would still hold on to the idea that Ukraine would eventually steer more closely towards the West and NATO. Now, as also Mearsheimer already indicates in his talk, there was also already in sight the very bad consequences, which eventually became a reality quite recently. Let's listen to what Mearsheimer says here.
There are many people who say the Russians are going to go on a rampage, they're going to try and reestablish the Soviet Union or a greater Russia, and so forth and so on. That's not going to happen. Putin is much too smart for that. You remember what happened when the Russians invaded Afghanistan? You remember what happened when we invaded Afghanistan? You remember what happened when we invaded Iraq? You remember what happened when the Israelis invaded southern Lebanon? You want to stay out of these places. In fact, if you really want to wreck Russia, what you should do is encourage it to try and conquer Ukraine. Putin, again, is much too smart to do that.
So this vision actually became reality, and Putin snapped and viciously invaded Ukraine, which was actually a catastrophe for Ukraine, and now is turning more and more into a catastrophe for Russia as well. It still somehow has some benefits for the West, because it gets closer together and feels itself very much emboldened and strengthened in its own vision of the world. The main problem, though, is that the situation is extremely dangerous now and may escalate further. What seems to be an unhinged Putin, who is attacking Ukraine, is being crushed by the West with sanctions. And on top of that, the West is all now increasingly supporting the Ukraine militarily. So in this way, of course, Russia's military invasion is also getting stalled. And this may actually lead to the following option described by Mearsheimer. Let's listen to this.
Let's assume that we're playing a winning hand and that we are capable of backing Putin into a corner. and we're getting close to pushing them off a cliff. Is this good? You're talking about a country that's got thousands of nuclear weapons. And the only circumstance, really, under which states use nuclear weapons is when they're desperate, when they think their survival is at stake. So what you're talking about is putting Putin in a situation where he's desperate. And if you go home and Google Putin and nuclear brinksmanship, you'll be reading all the articles that come up for the next 2 years, right? Because he's making it clear that you're fooling around with his core strategic interests. And again, he's got thousands of nuclear weapons.
So actually, what we are now facing is a potential for a nuclear war. Now, I wonder what led to this situation. And let's again listen to Mearsheimer.
We're basically doubling down. We're getting tougher and tougher with the Russians. That's our strategy. And that's exactly what you'd expect if you're going to blame them, given that we're incapable of blaming ourselves because we never do anything wrong. You all know that. All the problems in the world are caused by everybody else, never by the United States, because we're a benign hegemon. Well, if we're the good guys and they're the bad guys and they're misbehaving, they're bent on creating a greater Russia, oh my God, this is the 1930s all over again. Any sort of concession to Putin is Munich, October 1938. Can't do that, so what you do is you double down. You get tougher and tougher. Then this brings us to the question of whether we can succeed or not. My argument is you're playing a losing hand, right? And the reason you're playing a losing hand is because this is a competition between economic considerations and security considerations. The basic mindset of people in the West is that you can punish the Russians economically and they'll throw their hands up. My argument is when security considerations are at stake, when core strategic interests are at stake, and there's no question, ladies and gentlemen, in Russia's case, this is a core strategic interest, countries will suffer enormously before they throw their hands up, right? So you can inflict a lot of pain on the Russians, and they're not going to quit. And they're not going to quit because Ukraine matters to them. And by the way, Ukraine doesn't matter to us.
What Mearsheimer describes here is a kind of double-down strategy of the West. And this double-down strategy of the West towards its opponents in the East is very much based on the idea that we cannot have a repetition of the appeasement strategy that was famously, or I should rather say infamously, used by Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister at the time, in order to appease Hitler, which eventually did not appease Hitler and led to the Second World War. So the idea was we cannot have an appeasement approach anymore. What I'm afraid is that the alternative to the appeasement approach will be equally catastrophic as the appeasement approach was. And I think simply because appeasement didn't work doesn't necessarily mean that its opposite works much better. And this opposite is what I'd like to call the Pariah Principle. What I mean by the Pariah Principle is described on a slide that Mearsheimer uses in his talk. And this slide has a short passage from an article in the New York Times that appeared in 2014, around the time of the Ukraine coup, basically. And the passage says the following: just as the United States resolved in the aftermath of World War II to counter the Soviet Union and its global ambitions, Mr. Obama is focused on isolating President Vladimir Putin's Russia by cutting off its economic and political ties to the outside world, limiting its expansionist ambitions in its own neighborhood, and effectively making it a pariah state. Now, this is what I call the pariah strategy, and it basically has three components. And this pariah strategy has been used not only towards Russia, but also towards China, and increasingly so in recent years during the past, let's say, 2 or 3 decades. The first element of the Pariah Principle is make the opponent a pariah through communication. That is, a sort of evil profile is increasingly created through media communication and through political communication. The second aspect is, and I'm just using the words here from the New York Times article, cut off their economic and political ties. We saw this with economic sanctions against Russia after the Crimea was taken over. And of course, we saw it much more forcefully against China regarding companies like Huawei and others. Along with this was what could be called an undermining of the international relations of these pariahs. So Putin was no longer visiting the G7 summit, and there have been most recently diplomatic boycotts and things like this. The third element is, again quoting the New York Times, limit their ambitions in their own neighborhood. So, of course, the Ukraine is a prime example of this, but we also see similar things in China. Now, what I'm afraid of is that the Pariah Principle works somehow like a self-fulfilling prophecy, in the form of initiating a downward spiral, which we can now see in hindsight. The more evil you depict the pariah, somehow the more evil the pariah actually becomes. As opposed to the appeasement strategy which began with Hitler, maybe the result of the Pariah Principle is that you end up with a Hitler-like person. Because once someone has no reputation to lose anymore, once someone has been turned into a complete pariah, they can act without fear of losing their reputation. They have nothing to lose because they are already the pariah. So they sort of internalize and adopt the pariah way that they've been treated with and replicate it in their own actions. Now, is there an alternative to either appeasement or the Pariah Principle? I think there is, and I want to quote from an article by George Beebe, the former head of Russia analysis at the CIA, which was published just a few days ago before the Russian attack on the Ukraine. And Beebe concludes this article with the following statement. John Kennedy observed that the chief lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis was that the leaders of nuclear superpowers needed to defuse crisis by helping each other find mutual face-saving compromises. That applies today no less than in 1962. The window of opportunity for averting disaster is fast closing. As it looks today, it may seem that the window has already been shut. Now, what could such a face-saving solution for Ukraine, what could it have been? Very shortly before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, I listened to this podcast which a friend from Taiwan had sent me, and it's a conversation between Robert Wright, a US writer, and Nikita Petrov, a Russian blogger. Now, in this conversation at one point, Robert Wright refers to a problem that might have caused the conflict to escalate in the way which it already had escalated before the actual invasion. And Wright says the following.
You know, I'm going to have a guy on my show eventually who a political scientist who writes about what he thinks is the underappreciated role in just status considerations in international politics. It's like nations want respect. They want, you know, their perception of whether you acknowledge their status matters to them. Leaders, individual humans, we know want that.
Yeah.
I think Putin is somebody who thinks Russia's not getting respect and he's not getting respect. He's the leader of Russia.
He really wants it. I think that's one of his
and he really wants it.
Yeah.
And again, nothing I'm about to say excuses his behavior at all. But I do think American policy has increased the chances that you would wind up with a Russian leader who thinks he's not getting enough respect. And I don't think it was necessary.
No, yeah, I agree with you on the
So why was it not possible to treat Putin and Russia with respect any longer at this stage? And I think that's clearly an effect of the Pariah Principle that had been applied for an extended period of time. Because if you apply it for an extended period of time, it is no longer possible to step back and switch to something like a mode of respect. And I think this is exactly what prevented rational solutions to problems directly related to the Ukraine crisis, which are suggested here in hindsight by Robert Wright. Let's listen to this.
But I think what would be great if you, I mean, for example, suppose you said to Putin, he has his issue, I think rightly, with what we did in Kosovo in 1999.
Right. That's, which people say this was a major turning point. Yeah.
Well, it totally was. I mean, people say we're changing borders in Europe by force for the first time since World War II. No, it's not the first time, folks. Right. We did it in Kosovo, and we did it without the UN's authorization, and that really got Russia's attention. We did it in 1999. Yep. So an example of what a larger deal might be is we say, well, look, let's have the people of Crimea vote on who they want to be affiliated with, and let's have the people in Kosovo vote. And and the people in Crimea would vote to be part of Russia. People in Kosovo would vote to not be part of Serbia, and you would have settled those in international law.
So again, why was it not possible to come to such rational compromises at a time where it potentially at least would have still been possible? And again, I think it is because of the Pariah principles, because you do not compromise with a pariah. So what are the options now? So let's say Putin wins. Number one, is this possible at all? Even if Russia occupies Ukraine, as Mearsheimer already pointed out, and maybe puts some puppet regime there, it's going to be constant war. It's going to be an Afghanistan-like situation, which would be horrible for all sides involved. Well, and what if Ukraine wins? If the West wins, right? Would Putin just admit defeat, right? Or would he just up the ante, right? If he's only half the pariah that he's presumed to be, isn't it at least very much reasonable for a pariah to use non-conventional weapons and maybe even nukes, which is what he already said he would do? So I wonder if it is still possible at this late stage to find something like a face-saving solution that Beebe pointed to. Some form of peace treaties that somehow all sides can be willing to accept, that doesn't lead to total destruction and humiliation of either one or both opponents. I think it is essential to start de-escalation right now and to may be necessary to step back from the Pariah Principle if it's still possible, instead of doubling down further. One way, perhaps, of doing this, given the vote at the UN Security Council, where the resolution against Russia and its attack was blocked by Russia's veto, but Russia had no other Security Council member voting with Russia. There were 3 countries abstaining: China, India, and the United Arab Emirates. One way of potentially diffusing the crisis would be, for instance, for China to play some form of mediating role. And one reason why this may not happen is, again, the Pariah Principle, because China too is regarded and treated as a pariah. So you can't really ask a pariah, another pariah, to mediate with the first pariah. So here we see potentially a second problem that the Pariah Principle brought about. There is no neutral negotiator left. There are only pariahs and those who oppose the pariahs, but there is no room for anyone in between who can mediate. If we get lucky, and I very much hope we get lucky, and the Pariah Principle does not bring about and ends in catastrophe, I'm afraid the next conflict is just around the corner. And if this pariah can be somehow dealt with, then the next pariah will be China, and there is a clear and present danger that Taiwan will somehow become a second Ukraine. And a very similar playbook may be played out in that scenario as well. So my hope is that somehow we can go beyond the Pariah Principle and, speaking with George Beebe, find somehow a way for face-saving compromises.